She was not a wife. She was a ghost in a grand house, unseen and unheard. The Duke of Ashford had married her, but in the 6 months since their quiet, almost secret wedding, he had never once looked at her as though she belonged there. Alara Vance, now the Duchess of Ashford, stood at the tall window of the morning room, her fingers resting lightly on the cold glass. Outside, the grounds of Ashford Chase rolled away in perfect green slopes, immaculate and silent. She had spent hours memorizing every hedge and fountain, not because she admired the view, but because it was the only thing in the house that did not seem to recoil from her presence. The door opened behind her. She knew without turning that it was him. The air changed whenever Aldrich Ashford entered a room. It became heavier, quieter, as if the very walls held their breath. She turned, her heart performing its familiar, foolish leap of hope. He stood in the doorway, tall and impossibly composed, his dark hair swept back, his gray eyes fixed on a point somewhere just past her shoulder. "Your Grace," she said softly, her voice steady. She had learned not to smile. He gave the briefest nod. "I will be away for several days, business in London." He did not say he would miss her. He did not ask if she needed anything. He simply delivered the information as one might inform a housekeeper of a change in dinner plans. The hope inside her crumpled quietly like paper in a fist. She had promised herself she would not let it show. "I hope your journey is pleasant." He hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was so slight that she almost imagined it. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click. Alara turned back to the window. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, grounding herself in the cold. In those early days she had filled the silence with small, hopeful gestures. She had left flowers in his study. She had learned his preferences from the cook and ensured his favorite dishes appeared at dinner. She had waited each evening in the drawing room, dressed carefully, her heart racing at every distant footstep. He had never once commented on the flowers. He rarely came to dinner. On the nights he did appear, he ate in silence and excused himself before the final course. She had been a fool, she thought now, her breath fogging the glass. A hopeful fool who had mistaken a marriage of convenience for the faintest possibility of affection. But hope was a stubborn flame. It took a very long time to die completely. 2 days later, the flame flickered back to life. A letter arrived, not from Aldrich, but from his solicitor in London. It was addressed to the Duke, but the seal had been poorly fixed, and Alara's fingers were already opening it before she fully realized what she was doing. She told herself she was merely being a dutiful wife, managing household affairs in his absence. The letter was brief and businesslike. It confirmed the final settlement of the Vance estate debts. It referenced an arrangement made the previous winter, just weeks before Aldrich had appeared at her aunt's cramped cottage, and offered her his hand in marriage with all the warmth of a man signing a contract. Alara read the lines 3 times, the words blurred and sharpened. There was no mention of affection, no hint of personal feeling. The tone was one of obligation discharged, a debt owed, a transaction completed. She lowered the letter to her lap. Her hands were trembling, but her mind was perfectly clear. She had never known why the powerful Duke of Ashford had chosen a ruined baron's daughter, a girl with no dowry, and a name whispered over with scandal. She had allowed herself to imagine that he had seen something in her, something gentle and worthy. But there it was in ink, an arrangement, a debt, a duty. She folded the letter carefully and replaced it on the silver salver in the hall. Then she walked back to the morning room and sat down very straight in a chair. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the first months of her marriage, silent tears into her pillow while her husband slept in a separate wing of the vast house. Something inside her shifted that afternoon. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet, irrevocable settling of a door closing. She would stop hopping. She would stop waiting. She would become exactly what he had married her to be, a duchess who made no demands, who felt no disappointment, who required nothing of his heart. And perhaps, in time, she would require nothing of her own heart either. The transition was not immediate. It was a slow, painful unlearning. She stopped leaving flowers. She stopped dressing for dinners that never happened. She stopped listening for his footsteps in the corridor. Instead, she began to listen for something else. One morning, while walking the grounds, she heard the thin, hungry cry of a child from the estate village. She followed the sound to a cluster of cottages where a young mother was struggling to soothe a feverish baby. The local physician had not yet arrived. Alara rolled up her sleeves, fetched cool water and clean cloths, and stayed until the baby's temperature began to fall. She returned the next day to check on them. The day after that, she visited the elderly widow at the edge of the wood. Within a month, she was spending her mornings in the village, helping where she could, organizing the delivery of medicines, arranging for a tutor to teach the children to read. The villagers, who had at first been wary of the silent Duchess, began to smile when they saw her coming. They brought her their small troubles, their sick lambs, their broken fences. She listened. She helped. She discovered, to her quiet astonishment, that she was useful. She also discovered that she could laugh again. Not the bright, hopeful laughter of a bride, but something softer and more genuine. A village child would offer her a handful of wildflowers, and she would laugh with surprise and delight. An old farmer would tell a clumsy joke, and she would smile until her cheeks ached. These moments became her sustenance. They filled the hollow space where her longing had once lived. The Duke noticed none of this at first. He returned from London and resumed his cold, distant routine. If he saw that his wife no longer lingered in the drawing-room hopping for his company, he gave no sign. If he realized that his study was bare of wildflowers, he did not mention it. But something else had shifted in the air of Ashford Chase. A new name began to be spoken with warmth and familiarity by the servants and tenants. Not the Duchess, but a simpler, kinder name: Mr. Thorne. Thomas Thorne was the physician who served the estate and the surrounding villages. He was a gentle, soft-spoken man with tired eyes and a patient smile. He had been away for several months, tending to his ailing mother in Bath. And upon his return, he found a duchess bent over a wash-basin in a tenant cottage, her sleeves pushed up, her hair escaping its pins. He did not bow with stiff formality. He simply walked to her side, rolled up his own sleeves, and said, "You must be the new nurse I've been hearing about. I hear you've been stealing all my patients." She looked up, startled, and then she laughed. It was the first easy laugh she had shared with another adult in a very long time. After that, Mr. Thorne became a frequent companion in her charitable work. They sat together in cottages, discussing treatments and village needs. They walked the lanes between farms, talking of books and simple things. He never looked past her shoulder. He looked directly into her eyes, and he listened to what she said as if it mattered. The first time the Duke saw them together, it was entirely by accident. He had ridden out to inspect a drainage issue on the eastern farms and was returning through the village lane when he heard laughter. Genuine, warm, unguarded laughter. He drew his horse to a halt and saw them. Alara was standing by the stone well in the village square. Her hair was slightly windblown, her cheeks flushed with color he had never seen before. Beside her stood Thomas Thorne, holding a bucket of water and grinning at something she had just said. She took the bucket from him, her fingers brushing his, and she laughed again, a sound so light and free that it cut through the Duke like a blade. Aldrich Ashford did not move. He sat rigid in the saddle, his gray eyes fixed on the scene. He had never heard her laugh like that. He had never seen her so relaxed, so radiant, so utterly at ease. In his own home, she moved like a shadow, quiet and careful, her voice always soft, her eyes always downcast. But here, with this physician, she was alive. The realization was sharp and unexpected. It twisted in his chest with a force he could not name. He did not announce himself. He turned his horse and rode away, his jaw tight, his gloved hands gripping the reins until the leather groaned. The image of her bright smile stayed with him, burning behind his eyes long after the village was out of sight. That evening, he appeared at dinner for the first time in weeks. Elara was already seated when he entered the dining room. She looked up with a flicker of surprise, but it was polite, composed, nothing more. She wore a simple gown of soft blue. Her hair was neatly pinned. There was no nervous hope in her posture, no eager attempt to please. He took his seat at the head of the long table. The silence stretched between them. "I saw you in the village today," he said finally, his voice even. She lifted her gaze to meet his. "Yes, I was assisting Mr. Thorne with the well repairs. The old pulley was rusted." Mr. Thorne. The name came out more sharply than he intended. Elara's expression did not change. "He has been very helpful with the village efforts." The Duke set down his fork. A strange, unfamiliar heat was building in his chest. "You spend a great deal of time with him." She considered this for a moment. "I spend a great deal of time with many people in the village. It is where I am needed." It was a gentle, honest answer. There was no defiance in it, no guilt. And that somehow made it worse. She was not trying to provoke him. She was simply living a life that no longer revolved around him. The Duke said nothing more. He finished his meal in silence, but the food tasted like ash. When she excused herself politely and retired to the small sitting room she had taken for her own use, he did not follow. He sat alone in the vast, echoing dining room, a man who had built a fortress of cold indifference, only to find himself trapped inside it. The weeks that followed were a slow torture he had not anticipated. He began to watch her, not with the distant, indifferent gaze of before, but with a new, sharp attention. He noticed the way she smiled at the housekeeper. He noticed the fresh flowers she had started arranging in the entrance hall, cheerful wildflowers instead of the formal roses. He noticed her absence. She was rarely in the house during the day now. She left early, returned dusty and tired, but with a quiet contentment that radiated from her like warmth from a hearth. He also noticed Thomas Thorne. The physician was invited to dine one evening, not by the Duke, but by the Dowager Countess who was visiting. Aldrich watched from across the table as Thorne spoke to Elara in low, comfortable tones, making her laugh softly. The sound was a door slamming shut in the Duke's face. Jealousy was a poison he had never tasted before. It seeped into his thoughts, sour and relentless. He lay awake at night, replaying her laughter, the ease of her posture beside another man. He thought of all the evenings she had waited for him in the drawing room and how he had walked past the door without stopping. He thought of her flowers, which he had never acknowledged. He thought of her hopeful eyes, which he had extinguished with his cold silence. And for the first time in his disciplined, controlled life, Aldrich Ashford felt the sharp, gutting blade of regret. The turning point came on an afternoon of soft autumn light. He was in his study, going over estate reports, when a servant entered with a pale face. "Your Grace, there has been an accident at the old mill. The floor gave way. The Duchess was inside." The world stopped. The Duke was on his feet before the servant finished speaking, his chair crashing back against the floor. He did not remember running to the stables, but suddenly he was on horseback, riding hard toward the mill with a terror so cold it numbed his hands. When he arrived, a small crowd had gathered. Thomas Thorne was already there, kneeling beside a figure on the grass. Elara lay pale and still, a gash on her temple bleeding, her gown torn and dusty. The Duke pushed through the crowd and dropped to his knees on the other side of her. "Is she alive?" His voice was raw, barely recognizable. Thorne looked up, his expression calm but grave. "She is unconscious. She struck her head. I need to move her to the house immediately." Aldrich gathered her into his arms before anyone could object. She was so light. He had never held her before. She felt fragile, impossibly small against his chest. He carried her to the carriage that had been summoned, refusing to let anyone else take her. All the way back to Ashford Chase he held her. He brushed the hair from her face. He whispered words he had never spoken aloud, Words of regret, words of fear, words that might have been the beginning of a confession if only she could have heard them. She did not wake for 2 days. During those 2 days, Aldrich Ashford did not sleep. He sat by her bedside, watching the shallow rise and fall of her breath. He held her hand, cool and limp in his own. He sent for the finest physicians from London. He ignored his steward, his correspondence, his meals. The great Duke of Ushfkad, who had never shown a moment of weakness, was stripped bare by the fear of losing her. Thomas Thunna came and went, checking her pulse, changing the bandage on her head. The Duke watched him with hollow eyes. The jealousy was still there, but it was buried now beneath a mountain of terror. On the second night, when the house was silent and the candles burned low, Allura stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open. She looked up at the canopy of the bed, confused, and then her gaze found his face. She blinked, her lips parted. Aldrich. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was the first time she had ever spoken his name without the formal title. Something broke inside him. He leaned forward, his forehead nearly touching her hand. "I am here. You are safe." She was too weak to question why he was there, why he looked so haggard, why his voice trembled. She simply closed her eyes again and slept. He did not leave her side. The days of her recovery were strange and fragile. Allura woke each morning to find him there, sometimes reading quietly, sometimes just watching her with an expression she could not interpret. He was gentle. He spoke to her in low, careful tones. He brought her tea with his own hands. She did not understand this transformation. It unsettled her. She had spent months teaching her heart not to hope, and now every kind gesture felt like a threat to the walls she had so carefully built. One afternoon, when she was strong enough to sit in the armchair by the window, he came to her with a small velvet box. He set it on the table beside her. "I should have given this to you long ago," he said quietly. Allura opened the box. Inside lay a delicate bracelet of sapphires and pearls. It was exquisite and clearly very old. She looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She always intended it for the woman I would marry. I was too much of a coward to give it to you." Her heart squeezed painfully. She did not know what to say. She could not allow herself to believe this meant what she once would have given anything to believe. "Thank you," she said softly. "It is beautiful." He wanted more. She could see it in his eyes. He wanted her to smile, to ask questions, to open the door he had kept locked for so long. But she only closed the box and set it aside with careful hands. She was not ready to trust the warmth, not after so much cold. He accepted her reserve with a small, pained nod. He did not push. He simply stayed, sitting in the chair opposite hers, a man who had finally realized he was a stranger to his own wife. A week later, when she was well enough to walk in the garden, she found him waiting for her by the rose arbor. The autumn light was golden and soft. He stood with his hands behind his back, his face unreadable. "Allura," he said, and the sound of her name in his deep voice still made her pause. "I need to tell you something, something I should have told you before I married you." She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the breeze. She stopped walking, her hands clasped in front of her. "I am listening." He took a breath. It was the first time she had ever seen him look uncertain. "You know that your father's business dealings led to ruin. You know that many innocent families lost everything because of him." She nodded slowly. The shame of it had stained her entire life. It was why society had turned its back on her. It was why she had been living in near poverty when the Duke's proposal arrived like a baffling miracle. Aldrich's voice was low and strained. "What you do not know is that I was the one who exposed him." The world tilted. Allura stared at him, her mind refusing to grasp the words. "You." "I discovered the extent of his fraud," he said, each word heavy. "I had a duty to the people he was ruining. I reported him to the authorities. I gave the testimony that led to his downfall." She felt the blood drain from her face. Her father had died of a heart seizure a month after the scandal broke, broken and disgraced. She had lost everything. And all along, the man she had married, the man she had tried so desperately to love, was the architect of her destruction. "Why," she breathed, "why would you marry me knowing what you had done?" He took a step toward her, his gray eyes full of something raw and desperate. "Because I could not bear what I had done to you. I never intended for you to suffer. I thought only of justice, of stopping him before more families were destroyed. But when I saw you standing alone at his funeral, so pale and brave, something broke inside me. I had ruined your life. I could not undo it, but I could protect you. I could give you a home, a name, safety from the vultures who would have torn you apart." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "All this time, you kept me at a distance because you felt guilty." "Yes," his voice cracked, "and because I was afraid, afraid you would discover the truth and hate me, afraid that if I let myself care for you, I would lose you the moment you knew. So I built a wall of ice, thinking it would keep us both safe. Instead, I froze you out of your own life." Alara pressed a hand to her mouth. The pain of the revelation was immense, but beneath it something else was stirring. An understanding, fragile and painful. He had not married her out of cold obligation or indifference. He had married her out of a twisted, tormented sense of love and guilt. "I do not know what to feel," she whispered. He lowered his head. "You have every right to hate me. I will not ask for your forgiveness tonight. I only ask that you stay. Stay, and let me spend the rest of my life trying to earn what I should have given you from the beginning." She did not answer. She could not. She turned and walked slowly back toward the house, her heart a battlefield of grief, anger, and the faintest, most terrifying glimmer of something that might still be hope. That night she did not come down for dinner. He did not expect her to. He waited in the library, staring into the fire, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles shone white. The truth was out. The wall he had built between them had crumbled, and now he could only stand in the rubble and pray she would not walk away. She did not walk away. The next morning she appeared at breakfast. Her eyes were shadowed, but her posture was straight. She sat across from him and met his gaze with a steadiness that made his heart lurch. "I have thought about everything you told me," she said quietly. "I am still angry. I am still hurt. But I also understand what it is to carry a burden of guilt. I have carried my father's shame my entire life. You have carried yours alone in silence." He could barely breathe. She continued, her voice gaining strength. "I will not pretend that the past months have not been painful. They have been the loneliest of my life. But I have also found a part of myself I did not know existed. I have learned that I do not need your love to be whole. I am whole on my own." He felt those words like a blow and a benediction all at once. "You are," he said hoarsely. "You are far stronger than I ever was." Alara looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something that utterly undid him. She reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. "I am willing to try," she said. "Not to forget, but to begin again. Slowly, honestly, if you can promise me no more walls." He turned his hand beneath hers and held on as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had shifted beneath his feet. "I promise," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "No more walls, no more silence, only the truth even when it is hard, even when I am afraid." A fragile, tentative smile touched her lips. It was not the bright, carefree laughter he had unvud in the village. It was something quieter and more precious. It was a beginning. The winter that followed was not easy. There were days when the old shadows crept back, when a careless word or a sudden silence would make her retreat behind her quiet composure. He learned to recognize those moments and to gently, patiently wait for her to return. He began to join her in the village, not as the distant duke, but as a man willing to learn, to help, to see the world through her eyes. Thomas Thunna remained a friend to them both. The jealousy did not vanish overnight, but it softened into something manageable, a reminder to Uldruk of what he had almost lost. He even thanked the physician one evening quietly for being a true friend to his wife when she had needed one. The first time she laughed with him, really laughed, was on a snowy afternoon in late December. They had been walking back from the village, and he had slipped on a patch of ice, landing in an undignified heap in a snubbank. She had stood over him, her hand pressed to her mouth, and then the laughter had burst out of her, bright and helpless and utterly free. He had sat there in the snow, grinning up at her, his heart so full it ached. He had loved her too late, he knew that. But he also knew that love, true love, was not bound by time. It grew in the spaces left by regret. It healed wounds that seemed beyond healing. It was patient and it was kind, and it did not demand to be returned all at once. On the first anniversary of the day they had truly begun again, he gave her a simple gift. A letter, written in his own hand, folded and sealed with wax. She opened it by the fire, while snow fell softly outside the window. The letter was not long. It said only what he had never been able to say aloud. I did not know what love was until I saw it leaving. I did not know my own heart until I felt it break. You taught me that love is not a duty or a debt. It is a choice made every morning to stay, to speak, to trust. I choose you, Alara, today and every day, if you will still have me. She looked up from the paper, her eyes shining. He was standing by the window, watching her with that quiet intensity she had come to know so well. She crossed the room and took his hands. I choose you too, she said, every day. He drew her into his arms and held her as the snow fell, as the fire crackled, as the old house settled around them like a friend. The ghost she had once been was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned her own worth, and a man who had learned to treasure it. They were not perfect. They bore scars, both of them. But together they had built something far stronger than a grand estate or a noble name. They had built a home. And in the quiet hours of that winter night, with her head resting against his shoulder and his hand gently stroking her hair, Uldruk Ushfked finally understood what he had once thought impossible. He had found redemption, not in guilt or duty, but in the simple, unshakable courage of a woman who had taught him how to love. He pressed a kiss to her hair. She sighed, content. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a clean, white stillness. Inside Ushfked Chase, there was finally peace.